Okay, I'm Rohan from Long COVID Labs, and over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to try to convince you that long COVID is the most serious health crisis on the entire planet right now. I'm going to tell you my story with long COVID and how I cured myself. And then I'm going to tell you how we're going to use DeSci to accelerate a cure for 100 million people who have long COVID and save the world. Okay. So, long COVID is a big problem. There are almost 100 million people who have long COVID right now. It's costing the global economy about $1 trillion every year. That's like 1% of global GDP, which is an insane figure. And unfortunately, there are almost no government or big pharma efforts to cure this disease. So there are millions and millions of desperate people out there looking for a cure, and there's just not good options for them. Unfortunately, a lot of the research funding, even that's been allocated by governments to study long COVID, has focused not on treatments but on basic science. So there's no treatments in the pipeline, there's very few. And this has caused a lot of despair in the patient community. And I was one of those patients. So I first got COVID in March of 2020, relatively young, relatively healthy person, and immediately started to have these progressive symptoms that lasted for almost 2.5 years by the end of it. Memory issues, cognitive system issues, vascular system issues, just a host of problems. And I started to get desperate too. My background is as a neuroscientist and as a biotech founder and medtech inventor, and so I have a science background. And so because I was desperate, I started looking through all the research to try to figure out what was going on and if there was a way that I could cure myself. And that's when I came across this paper. This was in December of 2021. And this is an autopsy paper. So the thing about long COVID, it's a new disease, right? We don't really know how it works. And so there aren't good biomarkers for it yet. But if you cut people open, you can find the virus. And so that's what these scientists did. People that died up to 8 months after their initial COVID infection, they looked at all these tissue samples from their body and their brain. And what they found was that, surprisingly, the virus and the viral RNA for SARS-CoV-2 was all throughout their body and brain. This is like months and months after their initial infection when they died from, in some cases, other causes. The researchers actually looked at some of the virus that was in the brain and had been in people's brains so long that it actually started to mutate, which is horrifying. But it's actually also really hopeful, and it was hopeful to me because what this meant was that maybe my symptoms and that I was experiencing through what is now called long COVID were driven by this virus that was just still in my body. And if that was the case, then all we needed to do was find antivirals and clear the infection. So I started to experiment on myself, and I tried everything. I tried supplements. I tried Paxlovid, which is a viral replication inhibitor. I never got lasting relief, but then I took a cue from HIV research. Like in HIV research, a lot of times people use these combination treatments, right, to fight a persistent virus. And that's what I did. I used Paxlovid and a long-acting monoclonal antibody drug called Evusheld. So this drug was originally designed for people that are immunocompromised, right? So if you're immunocompromised, you can't mount an immune response to a virus, and so you're very vulnerable in the case that you get infected. So these people created this drug, which is basically derived from human antibodies. Someone who got COVID, recovered, they got the antibodies out of their blood, they found really strong ones, and they made millions of them and turned it into this drug, but they tweaked it. Usually antibodies only stay in your bloodstream for a short amount of time. These antibodies stay in your blood for at least 8 months, not longer. And so I gave myself a combination of these antibodies and a viral replication inhibitor and 3 treatments over 3 months. And after the first treatment, my symptoms completely went away, came back a couple days later, about 50% strength. And by the second treatment, my symptoms completely disappeared, and I haven't had any at all for more than 2 years now at this point. Which was incredible. You can see this is my journal talking about it, where I tracked all these weird experiments I was doing on myself, and I said, I'm so thankful and ecstatic, and I can't believe it. So anyway, it was a big deal for me because, like a lot of people with long COVID, we had no idea, I had no idea if I was ever going to be cured. And so I started telling my story to scientists and researchers in the space. I told Jake Glanville, who's a computational immunoengineer and a biotech founder who works on COVID-19 vaccines. I talked to Ruth Ann Crystal, who's a Stanford physician. She runs one of the largest long COVID newsletters in the world, and she cares for a family member who has long COVID. And I told Annalise Barron, who's also a Stanford professor of bioengineering. She designs COVID-19 therapeutics and is an amazing peptoid engineer. Super smart people, and as I started to talk to them, we realized maybe there was a way that we could take my N of 1 and scale it to millions of people. And so that's why we started Long COVID Labs, which is a DAO consisting of patients and scientists to accelerate a cure for long COVID. And I just want to show you this because this is kind of the core problem that DeSci, I think, can solve with long COVID. It's a huge, huge problem, right? But most of the funding that has been allocated for long COVID is right at the beginning here. It's in the basic research stage. People are looking, and these are great scientists, but what they do is bench work, and so they're looking at mechanisms, and the work is slow. And typically when you're a scientist, if you're a scientist, you'll know this, you do a little bit of work, you get a grant, you do a little more, you publish a paper, and at the end of the paper you say, and this is a grounds for another grant to like study more, right? But we can't go this slow, guys. There's hundreds of millions of people who need help. And so how do we accelerate this? We accelerate it, I think, with DeSci. And that's by flipping this entire chain upside down and focusing on treatments that are as close to commercialization as possible and working backwards from there. And so that's what we're doing. Our first treatment candidate is Paxlovid, which is, as I mentioned, a viral replication inhibitor, and Pemgarda, which is a long-acting monoclonal antibody, similar to the drug that I took myself 2 years ago. Both of these drugs are already FDA approved, which means we can start treating patients right away. We have 50 clinic locations already set up in the western half of the United States, which means that we can start to scale very quickly over the coming months from my N of 1 to 5 patients, 30 patients, and then thousands. If you go to our website now at longcovidlabs.org, if you're a patient, you can take this clinical assessment, which will measure your long COVID symptoms on a clinical scale. And we'll use that data to see if you're eligible for this clinical trial, or I'm hoping lots of clinical trials that will launch through this DAO. And in addition to getting people's data and patients' data, we don't want to simply be an extractive pharma company. And so if you give your data, or you participate in a clinical trial, or you're a scientist that has a new idea for a different treatment, you're able to get governance tokens in this DAO, this long COVID DAO, that then allows you to actually have a say in what we do, how we commercialize that data, what path we take, in a way that is actually meaningful. And this is something that I think is important because, in a way, this is the people versus big pharma. You know, we've sort of been left behind by governments and pharmaceutical companies, and now we're left to figure this out on our own. But I think we can. And the way that we do that is by bringing everybody along, not with the typical extractive model that pharma has used for, I think, too long. We could start a traditional pharma company. This is a huge, huge drug opportunity, is what a pharma company would call this, right? Hundreds of millions of people who need help. People see dollar signs. But I think that means that we have an opportunity to actually do things differently now because we have a little bit of a head start. And so this is our timeline. Over the next few months, in Q1 of the next year, we'll be doing the first 5 patients and publishing everything open source, our clinical protocols, exactly what happened with the patients before and after, everything, including the case studies. That will be followed quickly in Q2 with 30 patients. That's sort of our cutoff point to see whether this treatment is going to be able to scale to thousands, or we should reassess and switch to a secondary treatment. Hopefully it will work, and by the summer of next year, we'll start scaling this. I mentioned that we're focusing on treatments that are already in the end stage of those 3 stages of drug commercialization, which is things that are ready to put in people's arms today and start curing people of long COVID. But we also recognize that there is benefit in creating your own drugs and your own molecules, and we started to do that as well. This is some data from our broadly neutralizing antibody drugs. These are antibodies that have, similar to the drugs that I mentioned earlier, been tweaked to stay in the body for a long period of time, but they have additional modifications that allow them to be thermostable, meaning that you can administer these in ways that are cheaper so that we can get these drugs not just to rich countries that are able to afford expensive clinical treatment, but to the global south and the millions and millions of people who need help that aren't able to access the drugs that require a high clinical investment to actually deliver to people. The neutralization of these early molecules have already been assessed by 6 independent laboratories, and they seem to work. This is a longer-term project. It's going to take a lot more time, but these bespoke molecules, I think, are the next phase. We're doing this in parallel, but this is a way that we're able to, I think, in the future, create drugs that will actually be long-lasting against long COVID. And this is the last point I just want to make, which is the drugs that we're talking about here, these long-acting monoclonals, they can cure long COVID, and that in and of itself is a huge deal. That's a big, big deal, because there are lots of people who need help. But that's not the only thing they can do. And the truth is, guys, we actually don't want more COVID infections. Even those of us that are young and healthy, there's data now showing that every COVID-19 infection you get, there is actual literal brain damage happening. You lose between 3 and 9 IQ points. There is cortical atrophy. This is a virus that gets in your brain and all throughout your body and organ systems. A study came out last month that showed that after a COVID-19 infection, you have a doubled risk of heart attack and stroke for 3 years. And that was just the length of the study. This is a brand new virus. So we don't know what the long-term effects of getting infected with this virus are. And because we've had to go back to work in our lives, we have had to sort of ignore it. What's amazing about these drugs that we're developing through long COVID labs in this DAO is that not only will they help cure long COVID, but they can also act as a passive antibody shield, circulating in your blood, providing passive protection for all of us so that we can really go back to work and to our family and friends in a way that doesn't create this unnecessary risk and trade-off that we've all had to make, over the last few years. So I want to thank you all for your time. But we can't do this without you guys. Government has sort of left us to deal with the risks of long COVID and COVID-19 infections, but I think together we can find ways to actually make life more safe. And Big Pharma has left us behind as well, but that doesn't mean that we can't create our own drugs. And if you'd like to help us, please follow us. This is our Twitter at Long COVID Labs, or you can check us out at longcovidlabs.org. All right, thanks.